A Journey to the Center of the Earth, Chapter 11, A Primitive World. It would be impossible to describe the amazement and rage we felt on finding that we had returned to the shore we had left. "So," my uncle said grimly, "fate wishes to play tricks with me. Well, I will not retreat." "Listen, uncle," I said, "we cannot struggle against that dangerous sea again." "To the raft," he cried, as if I hadn't spoken. Hans began repairing the raft and loading our supplies on board. "There is no hurry, my boy," said my uncle. "We shall not start until tomorrow. For now, let us explore these shores, for they are somewhat distant from our starting point." We walked along the sandy shore for a mile. Then the sand turned to a dusty material. I was looking at the dust when I felt my uncle halt beside me. "What's the matter?" I asked, looking up. But he didn't have to answer. Before my eyes rested the fossil remains of every animal known to man, and some that were undoubtedly not yet known. And it was more than a scientist could stand. Suddenly my uncle's excitement rose and he darted over the dust to pick up a skull. "Harry," he cried, "this is a human head." I was as amazed and as overjoyed as he. A human skull from this period in history when no human was thought to exist, and a skull covered with a parchment-like skin, with the teeth intact, and a full head of hair. What wondrous soil was this to have preserved the head for millions of years? And the body, 6 feet in length, was there too, surrounded by this man's hatchets and flints. We were in the cemetery of an extinct world. My uncle quickly gathered up many of these specimens to convince the world above. Had these beings been buried by a tremendous earthquake, or had they lived here in this underground world? And were any of these men still wandering these shores inside the earth now? We turned inward toward a vast forest in the distance. We decided to see what the new discoveries the forest held for us. We had just entered the forest and were examining the giant ferns, pines, and yews when some movement caught my eye. I stopped in my tracks. There in the distance was a herd of mastodons, gigantic elephants of the prehistoric period. They were uprooting trees with their giant trunks and eating them as if they were leaves from a small tree. We watched in astonishment. "Let us get closer," my uncle said. "No," I answered. "We have no weapons. Come away, I beg you. No man could face these monsters." "No man?" my uncle whispered. "Then how do you account for him?" I looked to where my uncle was pointing. There indeed was a human being, a gigantic human being who seemed to be herding even more gigantic mastodons. He was at least 12 feet tall with a head as big as a buffalo's. A mane of matted hair covered his gigantic head. "Come, come," I cried, dragging my uncle along. "We must get away before he sees us." For once, my uncle did not resist my suggestions, and 15 minutes later, we were far away from that terrible monster. When we felt that we were safe from the giant and his monstrous herd, we slowed our pace and headed once more for the Central Sea. We were walking along the sandy shore when suddenly a bright object caught my eye. I ran to pick it up. "What is it?" my uncle asked. "This," I said, and handed him a rusty dagger. "It is only a common knife used by many Icelanders," he said. "It must be Hans's." "No," I said. "This knife is not a day old, nor a year old, nor a century old, but much more. Yet it is made of steel. Look at the mold and the rust on it. I recognize it as a Spanish dagger from the 16th century." "Then some man must have preceded us on this beach," he said. "And the jagged edges on the dagger look as if they were made by someone trying to carve a message on some rock. Perhaps by a man who was trying to indicate the road to the center of the earth." We looked at the rocks surrounding the sandy beach and found a narrow path leading from the sea to a cave. We followed it carefully, our feet in the water, to a huge overhanging rock. Beneath it lay the entrance to a dark cave. Inside the cave, we found a square slab of granite. On it was carved letters, which had been worn by age, the initials of the traveler who had made this journey before us. "A.S.!" cried my uncle. "You see, I was right. Arne Saknussemm came this way." Ever since we started our amazing journey, I experienced one surprise after another. But after finding the initials of Saknussemm here, carved in the bowels of the earth 300 years ago, I had to admit that now nothing of this journey would be impossible. "Let us go forward," I cried eagerly. But my uncle stopped me. "Let us go back and get Hans," he said. "We will still sail the raft to this point on the coast." That evening, we returned to the cave and explored inside. We had gone no more than a dozen steps when we were stopped by a huge block of solid granite. There was no turn to take. "There's no opening here," my uncle said sadly. "But what about Saknussemm?" I asked. "Perhaps this rock closed off the passage during the 300 years since he made this journey," he said. "We must find a way to remove it," I cried wildly. "Perhaps we can attack it with pickaxes and crowbars," my uncle suggested. "That will never do," I said. "We could never pry it away with ordinary tools. No, we must use gunpowder and blow it out of our way." "Marvelous!" my uncle cried. "To work!" By midnight, we had dug a hole in the rock large enough to hold 50 pounds of gunpowder. We then stretched a long wick to carry the flame to it from the outside the cave. Resisting the temptation to light it immediately, we instead slept until morning. The next day, the 27th of August, we were all up at 6 o'clock and ready. I took the lantern and went to the fuse, which would take about 10 minutes to burn. My uncle and Hans remained in safety on the raft. We planned to sail a distance away to avoid any effects of the explosion. "Are you ready?" my uncle asked. "Quite ready," I answered. "Then fire away." My heart was jumping. I lit the wick, then ran back to shore and jumped on the raft. Hans guided us a distance away while the fire was heading for the charge. 5 minutes, said my uncle. 4, 3, 2, 1 minute to go. 30 seconds, and then the roar of an explosion. The sea seemed to have gone mad. It became one huge mountain on top of which tumbled the raft. Then it felt as if we were going down a tremendous well. We clung together in silence. Beyond the rock which we had blown up, there was a great hole, and the water of the central sea poured into it like a mighty torrent, forming an inland sea and dragging us along with it. For 2 hours, the raft moved down this sea, achieving speeds of over 100 miles per hour. We held on to each other lest we fall off the raft and be killed. There was no doubt that we were upon the road taken by Saknussemm, but instead of climbing down as we had planned, we were taking the whole sea with us. After several hours, the tunnel widened, but the raft kept spinning and rushing by lightning speed, more than 100 miles an hour. I managed to recover my balance enough to check our supplies. Most had disappeared. Of all our instruments, only the chronometer and the compass were on the raft. And to make things even worse, no food, not even 1 day's supply, remained. Suddenly I felt a shock, yet we did not hit anything hard. Water poured all over us. We were caught under a giant waterfall which almost drowned us, but in a few seconds the raft was forced from under it, and we were once more along our way. "Harry, Harry!" I heard my uncle call. "Do you see what has happened? We are now being carried upward." I touched the walls, which ripped at my hand. We were indeed going upward, an extraordinary speed. The water of the Central Sea must have hit the bottom, my uncle reasoned, and is now forcing us up this narrow well. A whole hour passed. The fate that had awaited us seemed to be a rock roof at the top of the well and a crushing death. Chapter 12. A volcano erupts. We continued to rise at an alarming rate of speed. I was frightened by what was to come. My uncle must have seen the look of fear upon my face. While there is life, there is hope, he said. Let us eat something to keep our strength. Hans shook his head sadly. What? Yelled my uncle. Do you mean to say that all of our provisions are lost? Yes, I answered. Then I dropped into a kind of trance, dreaming about my youth and my home and Gretchen and the food we had left behind. When I awoke from my trance, I could feel a new sensation. The temperature was rising rapidly as our raft. I could not tell what the temperature was exactly, but I would guess that it had reached at least 120 degrees. Why the change in temperature, I wondered. If we are not drowned or smashed flat like pancakes, we shall be burned alive, I said out loud. My uncle just shrugged his shoulders and looked upward. I still have hope, he said coolly. Hours passed in this manner, and as we progressed upward, the temperature rose with us. I began to feel as if we were bathed in hot and burning air. Never before had I felt anything like it. We began to take off our clothing, the slightest shirt or undershirt being extremely uncomfortable. Are we ascending into a living fire? I cried. When the heat became greater. No, it is impossible, he said, knowing, however, that nothing in this journey was an impossibility. And yet, I answered, the walls of the tunnel are red hot. And listen, do you hear those thunderous explosions? An idea seemed to strike my uncle, and I could see his mind wrestling with it. Uncle, I cried, we are lost. We must be caught in an earthquake. The walls beneath us are cracking. The water beneath us is boiling. You are wrong, he answered, very wrong. What do you mean? I cried. This is more than an earthquake, Harry. Something more important by far. This is an eruption. An eruption? I gasped. Then we are in a volcanic shaft of a crater that is getting ready to erupt? Yes, he answered with a smile on his face. And this is one of the best things that could have happened to us. What? I screamed. Have you gone mad? We are in a well of burning and boiling lava, and we are about to be spit out of the earth, along with whirlwinds of flame and huge rocks, and you say, this is the best? Don't you see, Harry, he said calmly. This is our only chance of escaping from the interior of the earth and seeing the light of day. I suddenly realized that my uncle was right. We passed the whole night rapidly going up through the burning tunnel. Under the raft was a mass of boiling water, and under that, a heaving mass of lava and rocks. I found myself wondering what mountain we were climbing at such speed and on what part of the world we would be shot out, as if it really mattered, for there was no escape. Soon, a dim light reached us from above. To the right and left, I could make out long, dark hallways of rock from which awful smoke and horrible sulfur gases poured out. Tongues of fire, sparkling and crackling, appeared about to lick us up. The hour had come. Look, Uncle, look, I cried. Don't worry, he said. The tunnel is widening. It shall be over soon. The temperature had reached 200 degrees and sweat rushed from every pore in our bodies. And the speed of our travel kept us from stifling to death. About 8 o'clock in the morning, the ascent of the raft stopped completely. We moved neither upward nor fell back into the earth. The eruption has failed, I cried. We shall never reach the surface. Do not worry, my uncle said. The nature of eruptions is such that they move in stages. We will begin our ascent again in 10 minutes. And he was correct to the minute. Soon the raft began to move again. The heat was now unbearable, and I looked forward to being thrown from the crater onto the snowing slopes of some volcano in the North Country. The snow, ice, and cold would be a welcome relief from the heat of that shaft in which we now traveled. This stopping and starting occurred many times during those hours. I don't remember much of what came next. What I do remember is a mass of rocks moving upward, numerous explosions, and the raft going round and round like a spinning top as it floated on a stream of hot lava amidst a falling cloud of ash. The last thing I saw was the figure of Hans appearing to be surrounded by the halo of burning blaze. Then I felt a sensation like a man being shot from the mouth of a cannon with his body flying into empty space. And we'll finish this in the next part. Hope you're enjoying the story. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now. Love you guys. Bye-bye.